All right, everyone, welcome back to the Kyle Lamsalone Show, and we have a big one today. We are back in the Trump era, which means we are never going to have a shortage of content to talk about over the next 4 years. I'm sure, just like on today's show, we're going to get some really wild statements from Donald Trump to break down. Of course, he sees himself as the ultimate deal maker, and so we're going to often hear things about taking the Panama Canal or renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. But he also, slips in some more serious policy statements that are worth really getting into, diving into, and breaking down. So let's get into all that on today's show. Also, notice that we have quite a few people tuning in live. So whether you're on Facebook, at YouTube, go ahead and share out the show, give us a like, or however you could support. Let us know what you think about the show. And we're going to go ahead and get into the first clip we have today. This is Trump at his inaugural address earlier today.
Like in 2017, we will again build the strongest military the world has ever seen. We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars that we end, and perhaps most importantly, the wars we never get into.
So the end of that statement certainly sounds like a good thing, that we even have somebody close to, the positions of power who actually believes that achieving a peace is preferable to fighting a war. I recently wrote a column that was published at antiwar.com, judgenabs.com, and the Libertarian Institute, where I said one of the defining aspects of Biden's legacy will be that he often chose to fight wars when acceptable pieces were on the table. And so Trump outright saying that one of the things he values is achieving a peace is a great thing, because that's clearly something that's not valued by Democratic politicians in the United States. Even if we rewind to the Obama era, people like Hillary Clinton saw the war in Libya or unrest in Yemen or Syria as opportunities to wage interventions, covert wars or overt wars, whether you're talking about Libya or Syria, to take out leaders and to try to remake the world in their image. And Trump is saying that, no, we could do that by achieving peace. And so there is something good that we have a president that's talking about peace being one of his major goals. One of the problems is that Trump believes that peace comes through strength. And if we're going to, I think, see a lot of the idea of the art of the deal over the next 4 years, which means that you negotiate hard, that you make these outrageous demands to start, even outright threats to start. You remember back to 2017, threatening fire and fury with North Korea, talking about hitting the big red button, bringing devastation to North Korea that the world had never seen before. Those were all things that Donald Trump talked about and threatened. But by the end of his administration, it turned out that he had the most realistic North Korea policy of any recent American president, certainly had a preferable policy to either Obama or Biden. And so there is, real possibilities for the chance of peace deals, for things to move forward. However, I think Trump is mistaken in this idea that there always has to be strength to achieve that peace, and particularly, say, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, where we have members of the Trump administration saying that Ukraine needs to stabilize the front lines and they need to draft Ukrainian men as young as 18 years old to fill the gaps in the Ukrainian front lines, because they think the only way that you could actually achieve what they want to achieve in Ukraine, to get the deal that Trump wants, is to have the front line stabilized. But that's not possible. A lot of Ukrainians are going to die trying to achieve that strength that's not potentially there. And so peace doesn't always have to come through strength. It could just come at the negotiating table, getting whatever deal is acceptable. And so that's really important. Now, let's move on to the second clip, where Trump is talking about one of the things that he has already achieved even before coming into office. So let's play clip number 2.
My proudest legacy will be that of a peacemaker and unifier. That's what I want to be, a peacemaker and a unifier. I'm pleased to say that as of yesterday, one day before I assumed office, the hostages in the Middle East are coming back home to their families.
So what Trump is referring to there is just a few days before he took office, there was an announcement that Hamas and Israel had agreed to a hostage and a ceasefire deal. Now, this is important to remember that this isn't a peace deal as Trump is necessarily presenting here. It's not definitely bringing an end to the Israeli onslaught in Gaza. However, it is at least bringing a temporary reprieve to most of the fighting going on in the strip, allowing more aid to enter the strip. So, this is obviously a good thing. Hostages are being freed. I think the issue here is look at how Trump talks about it. It's all from the Israeli perspective. It's good that the hostages are being released. Well, what about the 90 Palestinian detainees and hostages that were also freed by Israel? Are we happy that they're back with their families? What about the fact that for the first time in 15 months or at least 13 months that there are people in Gaza who are able to go outside of their homes without worried about an Israeli strike dropping on their heads, that there's now 100 or so aid trucks entering Gaza every day. This is really important that this is all going on, but Trump is only talking about it from the Israeli perspective. And also, I don't know if Trump understands that, from at least what the Israelis are saying, what Netanyahu is saying, that this is really not a peace. It's just a temporary pause in the fighting. And so let's go ahead and play clip number 3, Netanyahu breaking down the peace deal. This was initially in Hebrew, so it's dubbed in English.
Since he was elected, Trump was completely committed to the release of the hostages. We spoke on Wednesday. He congratulated me on the agreement, and he emphasized, and rightly so, that the first stage is a temporary ceasefire. This is what he said, a temporary ceasefire. Towards the next stages of the agreement, we are holding on to some significant assets so that we can bring back all of the hostages, and in order to accomplish all the goals of the war. Both President Trump and President Biden have provided full backing to Israel's right to resume fighting, to resume combat, if Israel reaches the conclusion that the negotiations over the second stage are pointless. I truly appreciate that. I also appreciate the decision of President Trump to lift all the remaining restrictions on the providing of essential munitions and weapons to the state of Israel. If we need to resume combat, we will do so in new ways, and we will do so with tremendous force.
So the ceasefire hostage deal that was agreed to by Israel and Hamas last week is supposed to be a 3-phase deal. The first phase is the only part of the deal that's actually been really negotiated out. The other two are just broad ideas. And so the first phase is supposed to last 6 weeks, be a ceasefire and end to the fighting. Israel's supposed to begin withdrawing some forces from Gaza. The Palestinian people are supposed to be able to travel wherever in the strip that they want to. And over the course of those 6 weeks, 33 Israeli hostages will be released by Hamas. And in exchange for every hostage that's alive, 30 Palestinian detainees will be released. And if there are dead hostages that are released, bodies of hostages that are turned over to the Israelis, then there's going to be 20 Palestinian prisoners that are freed. And so we've already had 90 Palestinians and 3 Israelis go free under this deal. And so what Netanyahu is saying is that if when we start to negotiate stage 2, which is supposed to be the full Israeli withdrawal and the handover of the rest of the remaining hostages that are alive by Hamas, if Israel feels like those negotiations aren't going anywhere, then they could just go back to the fighting. And this is something that Trump has already promised them. And so if that's what's been said to the Israelis, then Netanyahu really would have been a fool not to accept this agreement, because he's going to get the 33 female hostages out of Gaza. Then he's going to be able to go back to the fighting, which is really what he ultimately wants to do. And then the second piece of that, of course, is that Trump is saying that he's not going to have any restrictions over the weapons the U.S. transfers to Israel. Now, there really weren't restrictions under the Biden administration, as far as we know. Biden postponed one shipment of 2,000-pound bombs to Israel, but that's not a major change in U.S. policy. And certainly, if that's all Netanyahu wants is those 2,000-pound bombs, it seems interesting that he even made the concession of agreeing to the peace deal for that. So I do wonder if there's maybe other things that Netanyahu either what just didn't bother asking Biden for because he didn't think he would get it, or because we just didn't know that Israel was asking for it behind the scenes. And so, to get a little bit more insight into what Trump's policy towards Israel could look like, and how he's really not going to be a peace president, a president that negotiates a grand deal, but rather seems to be the president that's going to turn a blind eye to Israel's total ethnic cleansing of Gaza, the seizure of, Gaza, potentially even the West Bank. What, Israel now controls swaths of Lebanese and Syrian territory. Who knows what's going to happen with that? But let's look at what Trump's ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, has to say about Trump's future Israel policy.
Do you believe that President Trump believes, and you do believe, that a two-state solution is the future?
No, I think we have to recognize there was a Palestinian state. It was called Gaza. Look how that turned out. You can't have a Palestinian state on top of the Israeli state if the Palestinians continue to believe that Israel shouldn't exist. Because the Palestinians don't believe in a two-state solution. They believe in a one-state solution, and their solution, and Israel disappears. That's no solution whatsoever. Israel has a right to its autonomous, indigenous homeland that they've had for 3,500 years, since the days of Abraham.
So Mike Huckabee really looks like he's had some rough times since he was the governor of Arkansas, and he's going to take out his maybe personal failings or whatever's happened over those years on the Palestinians. The pro-Israeli side often makes this case, especially to the U.S. people, which is that this is an existential fight, and it's either Israel or Palestine. That the Israelis, sure, they would love to live as neighbors with the Palestinians, but the real problem is the Palestinians just can't stand living next to the Jews. And every time the Israelis try to give the Palestinians just a little bit of autonomy, a little bit of sovereignty, they act like absolute savages, and you end up with an October 7th. And so the Israelis have no choice, that they are essentially waging a genocide in self-defense, is what Mike Huckabee is saying, that you can never allow a Palestinian state because that Palestinian state will try to eliminate Israel. And his example is Gaza, which of course wasn't a Palestinian state. It's a Palestinian prison. The Israelis controlled way before October 7th everything that came and left Gaza. They controlled how far the Palestinians could fish off of their coastline, when they could leave. Palestinian children would have to beg and plead to the Israeli government. Their parents would beg and plead to the Israeli government to get permission to travel outside of Gaza just to get cancer treatment. And to add to the cruelty, Tel Aviv often, if they gave that permission to those said children, wouldn't let their parents go with them to get their cancer treatment outside of Gaza. So, I mean, it was not a sovereign state. It was a prison for the Palestinians. And for Mike Huckabee to pretend that the Palestinians were living as just the neighbors of Israel in Gaza, and then they broke out and started killing Israelis for no reason, is completely absurd. But to really back up this case and how the mindset of Israelis and the Israeli government has changed, I have this article from Gideon Levy published at Haaretz, and this is a Jewish and a Israeli author here that we're talking about. This is Israeli media. This isn't published in the United States or by somebody that hates Israel. And so the title of the article is "No Innocents in Gaza," and he writes, Israel has become a state that aspires to the killing and the destruction of Arab society for the sake of killing and destroying Arabs. It did not used to be like this, and it certainly did not take pride in it. This is a profound change, one that we will struggle to undo. It portends pitch black future. When Meir Kahane emerged, he brought with him an Israeli-made neo-Nazi party that viewed Arabs as dogs at best. Israel recoiled from him. Voices were never before considered legitimate, infiltrated politics and the media. Soon they were not only legitimate, they were the voice of all of Israel's masses and also the government and military. And so what he is basically saying, and who Rabbi Kahane was in the 80s, I think mainly, he was a major Israeli figure, and he is somebody who advocated, carrying out terrorist attacks essentially against the Palestinians to drive them off the land. And in fact, the Israeli government labeled him a Palestinian and barred his party from participating in Israeli politics. And now, fast forward to 2022. Remember, this is just now a few months before the October 7th attack. Itmar Ben Gvir, who is somebody who believes in the message and the ideology of Rabbi Kahane, is made the national security minister of Israel. The Bezalel Smotrich, an extremist settler, is also put in the Israeli government. He's the finance minister. And so this is what he's talking about. It used to be, he gets into this article that sure, the Israelis did some savage thing to the Palestinians. If you look at 2008, 2012, any of the bombing campaigns by Israel of Gaza, absolute savagery, horrors were unleashed upon the civilians of Gaza. But there was an attempt by Israel to cover it up, to hide this from the masses. What we have seen over the past 15 months is Israeli soldiers posting and bragging about their war crimes on social media. They would talk about, and at the funerals of soldiers, they would give eulogies about how that soldier's goal was to go to Gaza and kill children. Soldiers would brag about how they ran over Palestinians and ran them down as they were just walking around. And, this is a new level of savagery from the Israelis. And the only thing he compares it to is the founding of Israel in 1948, which is the Nakba, where Israel ethnically cleansed and pushed 750,000 Palestinians out of what is now Israel. And so this is, I think, a really scary situation part of the Trump administration. If, Trump really is going to value Israel so highly and the Israelis really have gone so far down this path, what could Trump's support allow them to do? Now, there's one more thing from Trump's inauguration that I wanted to bring up. I didn't cut the clip for this because it's a very short thing that he just mentions that Mexico is becoming a threat to the United States. And one of his first actions is going to be to label the Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. Now, a couple months ago, this was predicted by Doug Bondow, writing at the American Conservative in an article titled "Risking Mexico in the Trump Presidency." And in it, Doug writes, "The primary drug problem is in America, not Mexico. Drugs cross the border because Americans want to buy them. Most smuggling north involves Americans. The Mexican cartels are not creating demand for fentanyl. America's formal military superiority would not guarantee an easy victory, and Washington would lack the local allies who did most of the fighting in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and elsewhere. Russia and Iran could be expected to aid America's opponents as obvious payback for Ukrainian war. Perhaps worse, with roughly $2 trillion in commerce, 1.6 million Americans living in Mexico, and extensive personal ties between Mexicans and Americans, there would be ample soft targets for cartel retaliation. That conflict might wreak havoc on the fragile Mexican state with potentially catastrophic consequences. The global war on terrorism caused extraordinary destruction, chaos, and death from which the United States remained largely immune. And of course, a lot of this is a geographic difference between the Middle East to the United States versus Mexico to the United States. And so I think that's a really important warning from Doug. And of course, the first and most important point there is that the problem lies within American society, that the demand for drugs, it was what drives the drug trade into the United States. And so we have to look at fixing our problems here at home at first. And this is going to end up really hurting the cartels if there's not as much demand for these drugs in the United States of America. But more importantly, this is going to be a failed policy. The Mexican government isn't going to help us. There's estimates that about a third of Mexican territory are almost completely ungoverned. And so the U.S. is essentially going to be fighting a counterinsurgency against cartels in these areas, where if the cartels want to, there's plenty of Americans that could be kidnapped. And of course, even if Trump is able to do what he wants to do on the southern border, the U.S.-Mexican border is very long, it's very rugged, and there's going to be ample opportunity for attacks on the United States of America by the cartels if we go down this path. So it's a real concern, and I really hope Trump, if he labels them a foreign terrorist organization, imposes sanctions on the cartels, probably not going to have a whole lot of effect on anything, but at least it wouldn't be going so far as to start carrying out military operations against these organizations. But I do think that's something that we have to be concerned about. Now, another thing to be concerned about in the Trump administration is his policy towards Iran. Just before Trump took office, Axios reported that there was a very real possibility, talking to members of the Trump administration, that either the U.S. or an Israeli-backed U.S. attack on Iran occurs during the Trump administration. And so let's look at this clip from Republican Senator Lindsey Graham on what he's going to tell Donald Trump to do.
And the next question for the world is, what do we do about the Iran nuclear program? That's where we're going to move to next. There's diplomacy. There's a 1 in a trillion chance you'll degrade the Iranian nuclear program through diplomacy. There's a 90% chance you'll degrade it through military action by Israel, supported by the United States. So the next topic I will be engaging in with President Trump is to take this moment in time to decimate the Iran nuclear program, because they're so exposed.
What does that mean?
Help Israel deliver a knockout blow.
What does that mean? You're going to urge him to have Israel bomb Iran's facilities that are underground and would require U.S. military support to actually be effective?
I'm going to urge the decimation of the Iranian nuclear program. I don't think diplomacy works. Brett will tell you what they have done to Hezbollah and Hamas has been amazing. The proxies are incredibly weakened. Israel can go anywhere they want to go. This is a religious Nazi regime. They want to destroy the Jewish state. They want to purify Islam and drive us out of the Mideast. It would be like negotiating with Hitler. I am hoping there will be an effort by Israel to decimate the Iran nuclear program, supported by the United States. And if we don't do that, it will be a historical mistake.
So I think the reason that this is such a concern, because Lindsey Graham is always talking about the U.S. bombing Iran. I'm pretty sure he wakes up every morning and thinks about bombing Iran and tries to find some way that he could get in front of a camera or get behind a computer and say something about bombing Iran every single day. However, one of the things that he has said, that Democrats have said, and that I think is going to be a real selling point for Donald Trump, is they believe they have a historic opportunity in the Middle East. They think that everything has changed over the past 6 months. And there have been some changes. The downfall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria certainly changes some of the dynamics in Iran's ability to ship weapons from Iran to southern Lebanon and Hezbollah. The decimation of many top leadership positions in Hezbollah certainly affects that organization. They took a beating from the Israeli airstrikes on southern Lebanon. You know, these are kind of undeniable facts that have happened. At the same time, there's this idea that these two changes mean that Iran doesn't have the ability to strike back against Israel. And that's just not true. We've seen it actually over the past 6 months when Iran responded to an Israeli attack with an Iranian missile barrage on Tel Aviv, and they were able to get through and hit Israeli bases and hit targets in Israel. And in fact, I think they got very close to the Mossad headquarters in downtown Tel Aviv. And so there's a lot of ways that Iran could hit back at Israel. And it's not so easy to just say Iran is now weakened, Israel could take advantage. And secondly, something very important to understand is that geopolitics and dynamics are always changing. And so, sure, it may be true that Iran cannot ship weapons via Iraq, Syria, and get them to southern Lebanon. But that's not to say there's not other ways to smuggle weapons to southern Lebanon, and that Iran may not have been cutting deals over the past couple of years. Israel has really stepped up airstrikes in Syria over the past 15 months in their bombing campaign of Gaza and southern Lebanon. They've also been bombing Syria daily, if not weekly, again, over the past year and a half or so. And so I'm sure Iran was already developing new routes to get weapons to southern Lebanon because Israel was striking everything they were trying to bring across Syria. And I don't know where that is, and I'm sure it's covert and happening. And so to just think that the Middle East has now entirely changed and Israel has a free hand to act is completely absurd. But that's what the people in Washington really seem to believe. And this isn't just a belief in the Republican Party. This seems to be a cross-partisan belief. And now, The other thing to mention here, of course, is just how crazy it would be to attack Iran's nuclear program. Now, of course, Graham always just says nuclear program, nuclear program, nuclear program. He doesn't get into the nuance of it, which is it's a civilian nuclear program. It produces nuclear energy and some nuclear medical devices using nuclear material, but that's it. And this has been inspected by the IAEA, the International Nuclear Watchdog. And we know for sure, and even the U.S. intelligence community has said time and time again that Iran is not building a nuclear bomb. They're not attempting to build a nuclear bomb. And so the idea that we have to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities is just completely stupid. And what Graham and the Israelis ultimately want isn't really to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities. It's to start a war, not between even Israel and Iran, I think, but the U.S. and Iran. That way, the U.S. decimates Iran on behalf of Israel and takes out another player in the Middle East who could potentially stand up to Tel Aviv and their expansionist ideas, their desire to expel the Palestinians and people from southern Lebanon. Now, to get into this cross-partisanship of this viewpoint a little bit more, let's play this last clip of Ron Emanuel from over the weekend.
I do think the Mideast is set up for one of the most significant realignments in our lifetime. You have Iran having lost both Syria, Hezbollah significantly militarily degraded. The fact is the government is also security-wise very vulnerable. Their economy is very vulnerable. People are fleeing Iran. They lack legitimacy. They've used weapons on their own people multiple times over the last years to stay in power.
So I really enjoy how whenever they talk about, oh, Syria or Iran lost Syria, they never mention who took Syria, which is, of course, al-Jawlani, HTS, a designated foreign terrorist organization by the United States. Jawlani, a bin Laden sworn terrorist. And so the idea that this is somehow a victory, is somehow a historic opportunity to change things in the Middle East, is a historic risk to Americans coming from the Middle East, but that's about it. Also, when he talks about some of the other things, the economy being weak, that the government turning against its own people, those things are just as true about the United States as they are of Iran. And so this fiction that we're going to have this great regime change in Iran is just simply untrue. And the idea that there's a historic opportunity in the Middle East, I really don't think that's true either. The threat, the concern is that the Trump administration, the people around him, the Lindsey Grahams, the Mike Huckabees, the Mike Waltzes are going to be the people who really have the say, the ear of the president. And I do think that saying, Mr. Trump, you have a historic opportunity here. You could take out the Iranians. You could reshape the Middle East for the benefit of the Israelis, is going to be a really big selling point to Donald Trump. As much as he would like to present himself as a peacemaker, I ultimately think he wants to be historic and to be remembered. And saying that he was able to remake the Middle East is probably one of the ways that he would really like to be remembered. And so with that, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show today. We've gathered quite the audience here over the past half hour of people listening. So before you tune out, go ahead and give us a like, subscribe if you don't already. A lot of you are listening on ads, watching on ads. Head on over to the YouTube channel and subscribe there. That way you don't miss any of our episodes. And thank you all so much for watching. We'll be back with another episode soon.